Imagine boarding a luxury expedition cruise expecting glaciers, wildlife, and the adventure of a lifetime, only to find yourself trapped in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean as a deadly virus silently spreads from cabin to cabin. No one knew exactly who was infected, no one knew how the virus was spreading, and by the time the ship finally reached land, multiple passengers were already dead. This is the terrifying story of the MV Hondius Hantavirus Outbreak, the cruise disaster that turned into an international medical emergency. And the most disturbing part? Authorities across multiple countries were racing against time because they feared the virus might already be spreading beyond the ship. So what exactly happened on board? How did passengers become trapped for days at sea? And how were nearly 150 people evacuated from one infected cruise ship? Now, let's get started. The ship. The MV Hondius is not your typical cruise ship. Operated by ocean-wide expeditions, Hondius was designed for polar exploration. Unlike giant floating resorts, this vessel focused on adventure travel, taking passengers deep into remote regions like Antarctica and the Arctic. The ship carried scientists, photographers, nature lovers, and wealthy travelers who wanted a once-in-a-lifetime expedition experience. In early April 2026, the ship departed from Ushuaia, Argentina, beginning what was supposed to be an unforgettable Antarctic journey. On board were passengers and crew from more than 20 countries. At first, everything appeared normal. Passengers explored icy landscapes, they photographed penguins and glaciers, they attended lectures and relaxed in the ship's lounges. But somewhere during the voyage, something deadly had already boarded the ship. The first signs of trouble. A few days into the voyage, one elderly passenger reportedly began feeling sick. At first, the symptoms didn't seem unusual: fever, fatigue, headaches. On a normal cruise, passengers getting sick is common. Seasickness, stomach bugs, and flu-like symptoms happen regularly. But this situation quickly became far more serious. The passenger's condition suddenly worsened. Breathing became difficult. Medical staff on board struggled to stabilize him. And then came the horrifying moment. The passenger died on board. For everyone else on the ship, the atmosphere changed instantly. What was supposed to be an expedition adventure suddenly felt like a floating quarantine zone. At that stage, nobody fully understood what had caused the death, but soon more passengers began showing symptoms. That's when international health authorities became involved. The virus fear. Health experts eventually suspected the Andes strain of hantavirus. Now, normally, hantavirus spreads through contact with infected rodents or their droppings, but the Andes strain is especially terrifying because it's one of the few forms believed capable of limited human-to-human transmission. That immediately triggered alarm bells. A cruise ship is one of the worst possible environments for an outbreak. Hundreds of people sharing dining rooms, shared ventilation, close contact, cabins packed together. If the virus was spreading between passengers, the situation could spiral out of control. Soon, passengers were instructed to remain inside their cabins. Dining operations changed, activities stopped, crew members began wearing protective equipment, and the fear on board kept growing. Passengers reportedly started wondering who was infected, who had been exposed, and would they even be allowed to return home? Trapped at sea. As panic grew, the ship headed toward possible ports for help, but another major problem appeared. Very few places were willing or prepared to receive an infected cruise ship carrying nearly 150 people. The vessel spent time near Cape Verde while authorities discussed evacuation options, but local medical facilities reportedly couldn't safely handle such a large-scale quarantine operation. So the ship remained isolated. Passengers were effectively trapped on board. Imagine the tension. Every cough suddenly sounded terrifying. Every fever created panic. Every announcement from the captain probably made passengers fear the worst. Meanwhile, health agencies around the world were trying to track possible infections connected to the voyage, because some passengers had already disembarked earlier during parts of the journey. That meant exposed travelers could already be in different countries. The outbreak was no longer just a ship problem, it was becoming an international crisis. The medical evacuations. As conditions worsened, emergency evacuations began. Some of the sickest passengers and crew members were removed from the ship for urgent treatment. A British crew member suffering severe respiratory symptoms was airlifted for medical care. Other infected passengers were transferred to hospitals in places including South Africa, the Netherlands, Germany, and Switzerland. One passenger reportedly died after being taken off the vessel. By now, headlines around the world were covering the story. A luxury Antarctic cruise had turned into one of the most unusual maritime health emergencies in recent years, and still, dozens upon dozens of people remained on board waiting for rescue. The Canary Islands' arrival. Eventually, Spanish authorities agreed to allow the MV Hondius to head toward Tenerife in the Canary Islands, but this wasn't going to be a normal cruise arrival. The evacuation operation was treated almost like a biohazard response. Authorities prepared strict containment measures before the ship even reached port. Passengers were reportedly instructed on how disembarkation would work. Medical teams waited ashore, security zones were established, transport vehicles were prepared. When the ship finally arrived near Tenerife, the atmosphere was surreal. Instead of tourists celebrating the end of a cruise, there were health officials, protective suits, and emergency protocols. The entire operation was designed to prevent contact between passengers and the local population.
How passengers were evacuated. The evacuation itself became one of the most dramatic parts of the disaster. Passengers did not simply walk off the ship like a normal cruise. Instead, health officials carefully organized the process in stages. Groups were screened for symptoms before leaving. Some passengers were transported using controlled medical procedures. Others were escorted directly into isolated transportation corridors. Reports stated that more than 140 passengers and crew eventually disembarked in Tenerife. Spanish passengers were among the first evacuated. Some were reportedly transferred to quarantine facilities and military-connected medical centers for observation. American passengers were flown back to the United States under monitoring protocols. Several ended up under quarantine in Nebraska and Atlanta. French nationals were repatriated on specially coordinated flights. British authorities also coordinated return plans for UK citizens. Other passengers were sent to countries across Europe under strict medical supervision. Health authorities tracked travelers across multiple nations because officials feared delayed symptoms could appear days or even weeks later. Some evacuees were told they could face monitoring periods lasting more than a month. And even after passengers left the ship, the crisis still wasn't over, because new positive cases continued appearing after evacuation. Fear around the world. As infected passengers returned home, governments across several countries launched contact tracing efforts. Hospitals prepared isolation units. Airlines checked passenger records. Health agencies issued warnings. The outbreak suddenly became a global story. People online compared it to a movie scenario. Others feared it could become another worldwide health emergency. Fortunately, experts repeatedly stated that the overall public risk remained low, but the situation still exposed a terrifying reality. Modern cruise ships may be luxurious, but when a dangerous illness appears on board, they can become incredibly difficult to manage, especially when the ship is thousands of miles away from major medical infrastructure. For many on board, the nightmare voyage was something they would never forget. What began as a dream expedition through Antarctica had transformed into a terrifying survival story. The MV Hondius outbreak showed how quickly paradise at sea can become chaos. Within weeks, a luxury expedition cruise turned into an international medical emergency involving multiple countries, emergency evacuations, quarantines, and global health agencies. And perhaps the scariest part of all, it happened in one of the most isolated places on Earth. Far from major hospitals, far from help and far from any easy escape. For the passengers on board, the journey was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. Instead, it became a floating nightmare. And even now, the MV Hondius disaster remains a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous part of a cruise isn't the ocean itself, but what might already be on board with you.